Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm a professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is a two-part lecture on the Eclipse of Reason by Max Horkheimer, Chapter 1. This first part, we are going to talk about objective reason and try to situate Horkheimer's thesis for this chapter and for the book as a whole. Part of the question that Horkheimer is asking here is, what is knowledge? Now, this might seem like a strange question to ask in general, but particularly for a critique of society or a book that plans to critique society. So we want to kind of situate ourselves within the project here by asking why this question is important. And we can do that by looking at recent claims about knowledge. Stolberg, who writes that new method equalizes stem cell debate, says, "My own view is that science ought to be unfettered and that every possible alternative ought to be explored." So this gives us a picture of science as enslaved right now or chained, and we need to let science break free. Now, of course, this was written 20 years ago, but I think 20 years ago is not that much different from today in terms of what science was like. So it's something to keep in mind about what Stolberg is asking about there. How is science unfettered? And then on a different discussion, someone says, "Some people say we are going to clone the world, but this isn't true. I'm asking all of us in the scientific community to be prudent and calm. We're talking science. We're not here to create a fuss." So here again is the idea that science is under attack, in this case in terms of cloning, which was a big issue, or a bigger issue, back in the 1990s. And it seems to say that science can just do its work without causing any kind of political fuss. We don't have as many discussions about that today. Certainly surprising given the outbreak of the coronavirus, why we haven't said more about what the role of science is. There certainly seems to be debate about this politically in terms of evolution and what the role of science can be with evolution and whether evolution is even true. So there could be some justification for these views, but they also suggest that science has nothing to do with politics. And part of what Horkheimer is going to do is challenge this by asking how it is that we think about things. So Horkheimer's thesis is, our conception of reason and truth have changed dramatically in the West, and to the detriment of human beings, so that truth and reason no longer provide access to an objective world. So now Horkheimer's writing in 1944 or so. So this is during or right after the Second World War. He is at the time a German immigrant escaping from Hitler's brutal rule. But he's also at a time when science is making a lot of progress. Certainly it has been a century of science in the world at that time. And Horkheimer is pushing back against that by asking, or at least putting into question, the conception of reason and truth, right? And he says these have changed in the West. And so what we want to do is situate ourselves into what this objective world is and how that plays in with this change in reason and truth. Of course, it immediately invites us to ask the question, why would we want or need access to an objective world? So part of what Horkheimer has to do is to answer that question. We, of course, can try to answer that question for ourselves, and I invite you to pause the video and think about this for a couple of minutes. Why is it that we would want access to an objective world? Or more importantly, why is it that we need access to an objective world? And what does that even entail? Now, Horkheimer is involved in what's called critical theory. He's one of the founders of critical theory. And just to kind of orient ourselves around critical theory, this is a Marxist-influenced critique of society. The goal, according to Horkheimer, is to liberate human beings from the circumstances that enslave them. So this could be a variety of things. Certainly for Horkheimer and critical theorists at the time, this would be capitalism. Later critical theorists might also say Stalinism. And we could talk about other things that enslave human beings today. So the objective here is to liberate ourselves from these things. Iris Marianne Young, a more recent critical theorist, says that it's a normative reflection that is historically and socially contextualized. So it's important to emphasize that critical theory will always be historically and socially contextualized. That means we're not thinking about theory outside of the box. This is not supposed to be some ivory tower reflection. So it rejects a universal normative theory. So there's no one answer that fits all. Young insists that without good social theory, normative reflection is abstract, empty, and unable to guide criticism. So part of what Young and critical theorists in general are trying to do is to find a ground for being critical. And Young, almost echoing Horkheimer, says that normative reflection arises from a cry of suffering or distress, or feeling distress oneself. So from hearing that cry of suffering and feeling that distress, this normative reflection should arise. Much of critical theory will be negative and imaginative. So how do we think about what's wrong with the world? That's the negative part. And how can we imagine what could be better with the world? So we want to keep those ideas in mind as we engage in this first part of the chapter. And so to think about, importantly, this thesis of Horkheimer, that the access to objective world is lacking in our own world. So Horkheimer says that in the past, human beings had access to objective reason. And he defines this in a dialectical way. First, objective reason is an essence or structure in reality that by itself calls for a specific mode of behavior in specific cases. So something that's in reality, the way that the world is structured, requires us to act or behave in certain ways. And the other side of that is the ability to reflect on objective order. So reason can reflect this order in the way that it helps us to decide what the best things to do are. So to give you an example, or two examples really, on the right here we have a picture of Augustus Caesar. This was a statue raised when he became the emperor in Rome, and it presents him as part of this objective order within society, that Rome is the leader, right? He's pointing forward and pointing up, and that he belongs to Rome, and Rome identifies with Caesar. The picture on the left is a picture of the hierarchy of being within Catholic and traditionally Christian thought. So you see down here at the bottom, there are images of devils and people being tortured. And then we have trees and land and animals. And we come up to people and angels, and then of course God at the top. So that's an objective structure to the world that orders the way that we're supposed to be, right? If we believe in this objective structure, then we are supposed to obey God, and the earth is here either to be dominated by us or to be to be in service to us, as are all the animals. Okay, so there's an objective order here, an objective structure to the world, and an objective way of being in the world for us. So objective reason and truth, there is here the sense that there is a comprehensive system or hierarchy of all beings, including man and his aims. and that truth helps us to discover what this hierarchy is. Now, I have to say this is a particularly Western way of thinking in terms of hierarchy. In my book, Reason, Tradition, and the Good, I talk about the Lakota view, which does not require a hierarchy in the world, but still presents an objective reason and truth. So just keep that in mind. Objective reason doesn't necessarily require hierarchy. It does require a comprehensive system where it depicts man and human beings in relation to the universe. And so part of what this objective reason and truth are supposed to do is to regulate our preferences, our desires, and our relations with other human beings. So how are we supposed to relate to one another? So in the Christian view, obviously we are supposed to bow before God and then use the earth to satisfy our needs. In the Roman view there, that might require some deciding what our relationship is to Caesar. However, we want to remember that for Horkheimer, objective reason has a critical element to it. So it's not about conformity. There's an obstinacy to objective reason. Horkheimer specifically references Socrates and Socrates' pursuit of truth as being an obstinate pursuit within the context of Athenian society, which was growing in wealth at the time. We can look more recently at Martin Luther King Jr., who writes during the Civil Rights Movement, "A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law." So here there's certainly an obstinacy to what Martin Luther King Jr. was doing, and this quote comes from the letter from Birmingham jail where he's responding to critics of his marching in Birmingham, and he's saying that the law against marching was not a correct law because it violated the structure of reality there, right? So we have to judge not according to myth or religion, but according to reality. The problem is that objective reason was dissolved over the span of a couple of centuries. And we can trace this back to John Duns Scotus, who talked about a twofold truth. Now, Scotus was trying to resist the incursions of papal authority on political power, and also trying to give more legitimacy to religious belief and truth. So what he wants to do is say that truths of religion are not the same as the truths of reason and philosophy. And so this arises from the desire to avoid religious wars and to avoid papal overreaching. So he's trying to be critical here, but what it does is it breaks reality so that there's no longer a structure there that we can pursue in relationship to finding what it is the right thing to do, right? We can no longer, if we follow John Duns Scotus, we can no longer look to religion for how we are supposed to act in the world. So Martin Luther King Jr.'s quote there would no longer apply. Calvinism certainly supported this with his perspective of Deus absconditus, which is the idea that God created the world and then walked away from it so that he is no longer present in the world. So objective reason has left the world, and the world is here to just exist as it is, and we must find our own truth in it. And then empiricism arose as a rejection of metaphysics, and certainly led to at least a quietude among metaphysics in the world for several decades. So what happens then is religion and philosophy fragment off and become separate parts of culture, right? And so we get Stephen Hawking more recently echoing some of the earlier thoughts that we began this with. Philosophy is dead. Philosophers have not kept up with modern development in science, particularly physics. So that the only thing that really matters is science, right? And so once we've made that move, we no longer have access to this objective reason. And for Horkheimer, that means we no longer have an ability to be obstinate and to criticize society. This is the end of part 1 of chapter 1, and I invite you to look at part 2 in the next lecture. Thank you.